Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past me, I will turn to see fear's path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. Hey guys, ETJ Writes here. I went ahead and read Dune the other day. Not because of the movie. I actually totally forgot the movie was coming out. I was at a bookstore waiting on something. I was in the sci-fi section because I love sci-fi, and this was prominently displayed on the shelf in hindsight because of the movie, of course. But that's not why I picked it up. I saw it. I thought, hey, this looks kind of interesting. Started reading it. The politics kind of got to me at the beginning, so I always enjoy a good politic in a novel. And I picked it up, started reading it, figured I might as well buy it, and I finished it. It's a very, very thick boy. I don't have any plans on seeing the film, neither film actually, the one from 1984 or the recently released 2021 film, because I did not like the book. I mean, it was fine and all, like the ecology stuff was really, really interesting. Some of the space politics were interesting. The world itself and how everything goes together was interesting. And Duke Leto was actually pretty interesting too. I just didn't like Paul. I didn't like Jessica. I liked Jessica's daughter. She was kind of cool. But I did not like the way everything was set up. And I just didn't enjoy reading Dune. I know people out there really, really love this book, and it was not for me. Arrakis, I don't know, I'm more of a Tatooine girl. If it all took place in the Star Wars universe, I think I would like it a lot more. But some of my complaints are that it's too slow to start. I think a lot of these things could be told through flashbacks, through Paul's dreams, and it spends too much time on Duke Leto and Jessica when we should be hanging out with Paul instead. And unfortunately, that really drags down the book. I've heard a lot of people really, really love Dune, and I have consumed so much Dune content in the last week or two, trying to figure out why. I understand the story, I understand where it's going, and I think it's really neat that the story is trying to subvert the chosen one trope, but it just didn't resonate with me. The storytelling style, the themes, the way everything's put together, I just had a hard time connecting to any of it. I think it's a really interesting story, a really interesting premise, a really interesting idea, but the execution failed to draw me in. And although I actually read it pretty quickly for such a thick book, I don't know, it didn't excite me. I wasn't reading it to enjoy it. I was reading it to get through it. And I don't know, it's one of these books, it's hard to dunk on it too hard because it really set up a lot of things. You can see Star Wars took a lot from it. The part I read at the beginning, the fear is the mind killer part, that's pretty cool litany, although it repeats the whole thing in fully 3 times in the first part of the book, and then we get references to it throughout. And it's weird because I find myself online, people talking about Dune, and I said, no, that's not what happens in the book. This doesn't make sense if you don't have that. It doesn't make sense. So I can defend it and talk about like things that definitely need to be in adaptions. But I don't know, I feel like this was so much setup, and it skipped large chunks that I have loved to have seen. If I were adapting it, I had mentioned this on Twitter already, but I definitely would have just started right when Paul has the assassination attempt on him, because that would have been way more interesting. And then the parts in the desert that were totally skipped, I would have added that, because when, spoilers, Paul's son dies, we feel no emotional reaction whatsoever. And I understand that Paul is supposed to be this unfeeling character, but you can have an unfeeling character and still get your audience to feel. And I think that Frank Herbert failed in that goal. One of the things I would have done is spent more time with Paul and Shani in the desert, really show how they love each other, or even if we're not showing how much Paul loves Shani, we could at least show Shani loving Paul. If we spent less time on some of the setup in the beginning, we would have more time to spend with Paul and Shani in the desert later, and to really understand why it's so important that Paul tries to ride the sandworm, and how much his son really means to at least Shani, if not to him. and why it's such a big deal that he has to pretend to be emotionless and just kind of let it go for the sake of politics when his son dies later, because he comforts Shani, there will be other sons, they can't replace our son, but you never really feel it. There's no emotion there. And then Lady Jessica, is it Lady Jessica's story or is it Paul's story? This narrative doesn't seem to be able to pick a side, which is really disappointing because Duke Leto and Jessica have a beautiful story. Paul has a really interesting story, but the way they intersect just drags everything down. I think if it had been two separate books instead of compacted into one big book, if it was Dune 1, Dune 2, and then Dune Messiah and all the other ones, if the first part of the story, and a lot of people feel this about the new movie, if the first part of the story was Duke Leto and Jessica and the story ends with Duke Leto's death, I think that would have been a really emotionally satisfying conclusion to that story. It would have been a big cliffhanger. Paul and his mom are off in the desert with the ornithopter. We don't know what's going to happen to them. And that's the end of book 1. Then book 2 is all about Paul and how he comes into his own in the desert. And you could really make book 1 much shorter. And then book 2 doesn't have as much space to fill, so you can really dig into the nitty-gritty of what's going on with Paul and his jihad. Speaking of jihad, that's another point I wanted to bring up. There's an afterword in the back by Frank Herbert's son that says this: Paul Atreides, who is the messianic Muad'Dib to the Fremen, resembles Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, a British citizen who led Arab forces in a successful desert revolt against the Turks during World War II. Lawrence employed guerrilla tactics to destroy enemy forces and communication lines and came close to becoming a messiah figure for the Arabs. This historical event led Frank Herbert to consider the possibility of an outsider leading native forces against the morally corrupt occupiers of a desert world, in the process becoming a godlike figure to them. Frank Herbertson also goes on to say, one time I asked my father if he identified with any of the characters in his stories, and to my surprise he said it was Stilgar, the rugged leader of the Fremen. I had been thinking of Dad more as the dignified, honourable Duke Leto, or the heroic swashbuckling Paul, or the loyal Duncan Idaho. Mulling this over, I realized Stilgar was the equivalent of a Native American chief in Dune, a person who represented and defended time-honored ways that did not harm the ecology of the planet. Frank Herbert was that and a great deal more. As a child, he had known a Native American who hinted that he had been banished from his tribe, a man named Indian Henry, who taught my father some of the ways of his people, including fishing, the identification of edible and medicinal plants in the forest, and how to find red ants and protein-rich grub worms for food. As I was reading through this book, I got a very strong sense of the culture, the Fremen, being Arabic light. And that's the best way I can come up with to describe it. And then lo and behold, I turn to the end of the book and find out that's exactly what it is. There are a lot of Arabic sounding words. Paul always speaks of this holy war, the jihad. Again, I haven't seen the new movie, so I'm assuming they don't say jihad because of the social and cultural implications that we have now come to associate with that word. But back in the 60s, that didn't have that same association. So throughout this entire book, jihad is used over and over and over and over and over again. And then you come to find out that yes, it was very heavily inspired by Arabic culture, and it continues on in the afterword about the Orange Catholic Bible, which is referenced throughout the book, that was a creation in the world's universe of a lot of Judaic, Islamic, Christian, and other religious, Buddhist, I think, cultures, which is really interesting. And while it's good to draw from history and from the surrounding cultures to come up with your novel, I wasn't thrilled with the way Frank Herbert put everything together. And I just always felt like he was borrowing poorly from another culture to create the Fremen. Now, the idea of the still suits I thought was fantastic, but again, if these people are so poor and have been living in poverty on this planet for so long with hardly any resources, how are they making these still suits? I know it says in the book that there are going to be these factories and the women work and do things like that, and they don't have computer technology the way that we have computer technology, but it's still, there's some plot holes there with how do you have the ability to manufacture some of these things and manufacture it better than people who have far greater accesses to wealth and resources. My closing thoughts on Dune are, again, I didn't really enjoy it. I thought the concepts were cool, the world building was cool, and the ecology aspect, I would have loved to see that a bit more about the terraforming of Dune. I just didn't enjoy the execution, the character of Paul, and the way that some of the cultures were represented. And there were some other like really creepy factors to do with the bad guy too that I just didn't enjoy. So there, just be warned, if you read the book, there's some stuff in there that might make your stomach turn a little bit. It's a little bit creepy. I mean, he is the bad guy, so you kind of expect him to be doing really, really messed up stuff, but it's wasn't for me. And so I didn't enjoy any of that. And I don't know how they treat it in the film, or if they're going to treat it more in the second film, which I believe was greenlit. So they're going to be coming out with Dune Part 2. But if they do continue that, I'm sure there's going to be some sort of backlash, so they may change it. And then, of course, they're going to get backlash from the people who really love the novel, and it's just everything has to be book accurate. And my thoughts are, this would have been perfect as an anime. And I'm thinking, oh, just like something from like the late 1980s, that really weird, creeping Japanese horror that when you watch it really creeps you out and sticks with you for days, because Dune is not really a cool adventure story. It's a horror story about the chosen one and his ability to lead people into jihad. And it's, yeah, I think the horror would come across much more clearly, and maybe, you know, that would be a great way to adapt it too. Instead of trying to make it an epic sci-fi, this is sci-fi horror, and you don't really realize until you're finished reading it. I think a lot of people want to get into the third, fourth book to be like, oh yeah, this is the sci-fi horror, because there's some weird stuff happens. I looked at the wiki, and once I saw some of the stuff that goes on in the later books, I just noped out. If it were an anime and it was kind of featured as a horror anime, I think it would be really, really cool, because that would be able to capture the weirdness of this universe really much better than I think a film does. And I think people go into a film expecting epic adventure, and that's not what the story is. So again, I didn't like it. I think it would be good as an anime, but it was really interesting to read, to see where a lot of the modern sci-fi ideas have come from. And I do think it was really an interesting way to see a universe without computers. It was kind of like steampunk in space, except it wasn't steampunk. It was more like diesel punk, except that the diesel was spice, if that makes sense. So spice punk, I guess, could be a new genre. Spice punk in space. Yeah, if that's your thing, check it out. I'm sure a lot of people have already picked it up due to the movie. Like I said, I have no intentions of seeing it, but I've consumed a lot of Dune content via podcasts and videos about the film, and it's definitely worth checking out just to understand how much of a cultural zeitgeist the book is, and is probably going to continue to be. But until next time, happy reading. ETJ out.